I want to get the policy. When is Kansas going to stop complaining about these debates? I mean, my goodness, it's
you know, all I would ask is, you know, some people say, no, we want Republican moderators. I think that's crazy, but I think it's not too much to ask that we have objective moderators. And I've done a lot of interviews with probably almost every national person on television, and I can tell you 10 right off the bat that I cannot tell whether they're a Republican or a Democrat. That's who I think ought to be moderating. There are many people who are partisans on both sides, but they really shouldn't be moderating.
Well, some folks actually care about issues as opposed to entertainment value. And I think what you've seen is a lot of entertainment back and forth.
I think you're right, and I think the thing is like, for example, I had to work very hard to get 30 seconds in on my tax plan, but there's like 6 tax plans. We should let each candidate present at least a minute about what their tax plan's about and what are the contrasts between the two. Like, if you're Rubio, what's the Rubio tax plan? What's the Paul tax plan? What's the Bush tax plan? I think you could watch for 2 hours and not know what anybody's tax plan was by the time you got to the end of the 2 hours.
Right, of course, you will hear about comic books and all kind of other stuff like that, and fantasy football, which is hilarious, which is unbelievable to me. So, policy, I think, is critically important, and so what I keep getting from African Americans is I'm not hearing what actually matters to us. And so what's interesting to me is in asking you, one of the things that is major, entrepreneurship for African Americans. Black women start businesses at a faster rate than anybody else. In 2013, Wall Street Journal, actually 2014, Wall Street Journal had a huge piece showing that African Americans got less than 2% of $23.09 billion in small business loans. 8.2% in the last year of President Bush. If you're president, how will you change that to ensure that capital is flowing to African Americans who want to be entrepreneurs, who want to grow businesses, who want scale, but who simply can't get dollars?
Right. As far as government money, I think it has to be equal protection under the law in the sense that everybody should have equal access to it. And we need to be very certain that it is dispersed in that way and that there isn't any, even if it's not overt, that there's not a racial outcome to the way money is dispersed. But above and beyond that, something that's a much bigger pie of money is something that I want to do called economic freedom zones. And that is to leave extraordinary amounts of money in communities and encourage businesses to go to those communities, hire people, and have businesses there. Now, it's easier said than done. Everybody's been saying this for decades. But what I would do is do it in a dramatic fashion. So the south side of Chicago is pretty poor. I was down in Inglewood on the most dangerous corner of probably in America, right across from the O Block housing project. And I went around with a local minister and we talked about how we'd rejuvenate that. My plan would leave $3 billion in the south side of Chicago. I wouldn't send it to the Chicago government. I wouldn't send it to the federal government. I would just simply leave it in that area. And so businesses that are already there will thrive. That's the best way to create jobs. If you're already in the south side of Chicago and you have 20 employees, the best way to make a job is to let you get 30 employees. Starting from scratch is always harder. But I think we'd get both. And then we would encourage people who move in to have a very low tax rate. So if you're the vice president of a bank in the suburbs of Chicago, you're going to pay 30% or whatever the income tax is. But if you move to the south side of Chicago and you'll sit there and live there and have your bank in the south side of Chicago, you'd pay 5% income tax. I want it so dramatic that everybody wants to move there, that people want to actually move to that area and say, gosh, I can make twice as much money here. Money counts. Money talks.
Well, and speaking of that, I mean, one of the reasons also folks are not able to get loans because it's tied to housing. 53% of black wealth wiped out because of the home foreclosure crisis in this country. I've been very critical of the president's housing policies because I believe they have not properly impacted those who are most in need. What is your housing plan? Because we know most Americans, their wealth comes from owning their home, and that money that black folks lost, some will say it will take 2 generations just to recoup that money that was lost.
No, I think that's a big point. You develop capital and you get richer generation to generation when you have a house. I mean, that's where most Americans' capital is tied up. One of the things that I think in the minority community that is really bad is that you don't have inheritance in the sense that many people don't. But the one thing you do is you pay everybody, every working class person pays payroll tax their whole life, and it builds up, but you don't get any of it, and your kids don't get any of it because there's no inheritability to Social Security. And I know this may be controversial, but I would individualize Social Security accounts. So your name's on it, and just the same way you'd type in your number for a 401k, you'd type in your number, and in your Social Security account you'd say, wow, I put in $100,000 over my working career, and if I die at 65, my kids get it, you know, and then there'd be some inheritability and we'd develop wealth over time. But we have a system now that it's gotten too involved in so many things that there's not enough money even for those on Social Security.
So if you have, you turn 65, so let's say if you look at the death rates of black men younger than any someone else. And so under your plan, let's say if someone dies at the age of 60, so you're saying that that's essentially money that is accrued, and then that money would then go to a family member when you pass away.
Exactly. It'd be inheritable, because what happens now is initially Social Security worked on everybody dying young. Now there is a racial disparity in death. Black men do die younger than the average population for the at whole, and so I think it is a real problem, and you would have some capital begin to form generation to generation. But the bottom line is we have to create a more opportunity in society, and that's why I've said, see, we've had this problem, and unfortunately we've made it a partisan problem between Republicans and Democrats, but we've had enormous amounts of poverty in our cities for decade upon decade. In the 60s we started the war on poverty, but I think we still have enormous amounts of poverty, enormous amounts of incarceration, drug problem, back into prison, out of prison, and there's in some ways not a lot of hope. And I think we ought to, at the very least, talk about something new and different than what we've tried in the past. And to me, that's created enormous incentives, not little incentives, not a little tax credit here or there, but enormous incentives that people would want to move back into the city or into the city and bring their business into the city.
But you also have tremendous poverty in rural America.
You do.
And how do you see getting rural whites to realize that they're in the same economic and educational condition as blacks and Latinos in inner cities? And as I always say, broke is broke.
We have the contrast in my state, for example. We have a large rural white population in eastern Kentucky that lives in poverty, and you've heard of Appalachian programs. We've had this for decade after decade. But just like our inner city programs, they haven't necessarily worked. Some of it's harder to grasp. It's sort of not as tangible, but it's education. And education is real and makes a difference. But I'll give you a contrast. I grew up and went to public schools in Texas, in sort of a suburb.
Same here.
Yeah, richer sort of suburb.
Not suburb. I got you.
But I had anatomy and physiology, physics, calculus, all in high school. I had a great high school. It probably rivals private high schools. So public high schools can be good, but I've also visited parts of our cities, most of our cities, but probably also rural America as well, where they don't teach any of those courses there, and 50% of the people drop out. I would give every kid in America the choice to go to whatever school they want. So if you live on the south side of Chicago, and there's a rich neighborhood that's about 15 miles from you, and your mom or your dad will drive you out there, I'd let you take your money and go. And I'd say it's yours. It's a voucher, and you can go wherever you want. Then what would happen is competition makes us all better.
Now, is that vouchers for all students, or would it be based upon income?
I do it for all, but I mean, what they've done in some states, in Florida and other states, is to start out with doing it, and I'd vote for any of it. So if they started and they said, oh, we're only going to do it for underprivileged kids, I'd vote for that too. But really, I think choice makes us all better and will make all the schools better. The other thing that we need, and there's a miracle waiting to happen, but the educational establishment is in the way. The miracle is the internet. And we think, oh, we'll give every kid a smartphone, they'll be smart. That isn't it. But connect every kid to a great teacher. So let's say I live in a little tiny town in, let's say, Alabama, 100 miles away from any place, and there's only 500 people there, and there is no calculus teacher. The internet should connect me. If it turns out that there's a bright kid in that school that wants to do advanced science or math, we should connect them to a teacher in Boston. See, the internet should connect you around the world to the world's greatest teachers. Then I'd also pay some of the world's greatest teachers, like NFL players or NBA players, because I'd find them and I'd connect them to every kid. But one teacher might be giving a lecture that, say, the introductory lecture in calculus. She or he is so good at it that everyone in the whole country may listen to that introductory lecture because it's so good. You would still have a local teacher, but you connect some of the best teachers in the world. That is a miracle waiting to happen. It'll bring great education to every kid in every school everywhere. Then you have to have some other things, discipline, keep drugs out of school, things like that. But there's a miracle waiting to happen in education. But I think people who live in poor circumstances aren't getting the same education that kids that live in a better area.
Let's talk criminal justice. What we're seeing now is, and I want to get, what are your thoughts about the Black Lives Matter movement? I believe what you have seen is you've seen this movement force a level of transparency and change we have not seen when it comes to law enforcement ever. 40 new laws passed in 24 states. You see NYPD all of a sudden, cops have to now mark excessive force. You're seeing body cameras. Yet the movement is constantly being attacked, I think, because, frankly, they're forcing change.
Well, you know, I'm for most of the change, and I'm for most of the things they have supported. I'm for the you know, the cameras. I worked with Congressman Scott on reports of deaths in the hands of custody. I thought the Eric Garner case and all of these other cases were just real tragedies. The only thing I've hesitated with making it all about race is when you look at the war on drugs and you look at incarceration, there is a racial disparity, no question, and it is a problem we need to address. But when you look at policing, and like I read one the other day, someone was thrown to the ground and treated, I think, awfully. But one of the policemen was black. Police chief was black. So if we make it all about race, we're going to mistake the problem. What we really need to understand...
For police is blue, because you're right. I mean, look, you have police officers who are African American. There are some in the Freddie Gray case in Baltimore who were indicted. Right. So that's what I'm saying. I don't necessarily think Black Lives Matter is about white cops versus African Americans, although you do hear that. Right. I think it's a question literally of just law enforcement, this culture, this attitude where it's protect blue, where it's protect and serve, a lot of times protect themselves versus the public.
Right, but what I would say is it's police behavior, but there are a lot of good police too.
Yes.
And then there's also it's policymakers. So I tend to like it's sort of like when something happens bad in war, the soldier's responsible maybe for something that happens, but really the policymakers is responsible for putting that position. Eric Garner, for example, the mayor wants tax money and they don't want you selling illegal cigarettes, a huge financial thing. Mayor de Blasio has been a big part of that, but he doesn't want to accept the blame for his policy. He instructed the police to take people down. Now, he didn't instruct them to kill Eric Garner, but he did instruct the police, we're going to take down, we're going to have a zero tolerance for cigarettes. He didn't even have any cigarettes on him. It was ridiculous. And nobody deserves to die that way. But the thing is I blame the policymakers who are like, let's have the police stopping rapists and murderers, and some guy wants to sell a cigarette on the corner, let's give him a ticket. You know, if it has to be against the law, give him a ticket. If he comes back, give him another ticket. If it comes back, I mean, there's a lot of other ways to treat this other than saying we're going to have a zero tolerance and we're going to use force against somebody selling cigarettes on the sidewalk.
But do you believe that the Black Lives Matter movement has forced the kind of accountability that has been positive for the country?
They're drawing attention to issues that need to be drawn to. And like I say, I support almost all the criminal justice. The president and I don't get along on very many issues, but we're in complete agreement on the criminal justice. And when the president's trying to fix some of the crack versus powder cocaine disparity in jail.
So there's still 18-1.
Yeah, I'm supportive not only of what he's doing, he's releasing some of the people who are nonviolent criminals, but I would change it to 1-to-1. And in fact, when the criminal justice bill comes forward, they don't have it in the current bill. I will try to amend that. I'm also going to try to make some felonies to misdemeanors. I'm also going to try to allow some of the expunging of records that Senator Booker and I have worked on. So there's a lot of good stuff. The only thing I don't want to do is and I think it misunderstands, because I have a lot of policemen that protect me. Many of them are African American, and I ask them about it, and they don't want to make it about race, because obviously they're black, patrolling black. What we have to do is change the law about the war on drugs. There's no reason we should be arresting everybody for marijuana, because what happens is the police go into the inner city and then they're arresting, so the arrests end up being 15 black kids to 1 white kid, but the surveys show white kids smoking pot just as much as black kids, but the police are always in that area. And it isn't overtly say, oh, let's go round up black kids. It just happens they're in a poorer neighborhood and there's a higher percentage of African Americans there.
Last question for you. You have been demanding that Republican Party do more in terms of reaching out to African Americans. I've been saying Republicans got to stop being afraid to talk to black people, visit with black folks. Should there be a Republican forum, town hall, if you will, that specifically is speaking to issues of African Americans, of these various candidates, to talk about these issues that, frankly, you're not going to be brought up by CNN, MSNBC, or Fox?
If we were smart, we would do it. And I've been trying to go places, because you know what I find all the time? People aren't jumping up and down and saying, when I go to the south side of Chicago, not everybody's coming up and saying, hey, I want to be a Republican. But, you know, they're saying, you know what, we want somebody to compete for our vote. The Democrats take us for granted, and they never come down here anyway, because they know we're all going to vote Democrat. We're not sure we're a Republican yet, but we do want to hear some new and different ideas, and we want people to compete for our vote. I hear the same thing in Louisville, and I'm excited about it. You know, I might go from 5% to 10% of the African American vote, or maybe 20%, but I want to make inroads, because really I want to represent, particularly in my state, everyone.
All right, then. Well, Senator Rand Paul, we appreciate it. Sure to come back anytime. Our show is, unlike other shows, I have no problem talking to Republicans and hearing various ideas and having a nice conversation and debate. Sure to appreciate it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.